A beam swung in on a cable, slow as a pendulum, while a man below stepped back without looking and vanished through a raw, open elevator shaft. 10 seconds later, someone slid a plank over the hole and yelled for the hoist to keep moving. That's the paradox of the Empire State Building. It rose as a national miracle, but it ran like a machine that couldn't afford to notice bodies. Why does a record-breaking monument need speed so badly it can't stop for death? I'm James. Before we go any further, lock this into your mind. This job was treated like a timed race. The schedule was a whip. The deliveries were a conveyor belt. The crews were measured in floors. When a site is built around momentum, safety becomes a personal superstition because the system itself doesn't slow down. March 1930. Fifth Avenue is a throat full of noise. Trucks back in, men shout signals, chains rattle. Derricks lift steel as if gravity is just a suggestion. The old hotel is gone. In its place is a grid that climbs every day, and the city watches like it's watching a prize fight. On the upper steel, Frank Frenchy Goslin, connector, beam catcher, the kind of man who lives in inches, stands on a flange barely wider than his boot. He doesn't look down. He watches the beam. He watches the wind. He watches the hook, because the hook is what kills you when your attention drifts. A few floors below, Neil Doherty's rivet gang turns the skeleton into something permanent. The heater's bucket glows, the catcher's tongs snap, the gun barks, and the entire frame shivers with each hot rivet hammered home. Men on the street will later talk about bravery. Up here, it looks more like discipline. No wasted motion, no hesitation, no room for a tremble. Down at ground level, the site is worse in a different way. It's crowded, loud, frantic. Loads come in faster than they can be stacked. Ropes coil like snakes. Hooks swing. Men weave between reversing trucks with their heads tilted up, trying to predict what might fall. Tommy Delaney runs messages and carries bolts. He's 19, thin from bad months, and he moves like a man who knows he's replaceable. The foreman's rule is simple. Stay out of the way of the steel, and don't become the reason the line stops. That morning, a temporary elevator shaft sits open like a missing floorboard in the sky. The opening is framed and waiting for rails that will be installed, because on this job, will is always later. There's a plank across the lip. One end is nailed, one end isn't. The plank is enough to convince the eye. It isn't enough to stop gravity. Salvatore Sal Marino, labourer, quick hands, always joking because joking makes fear smaller, backs up with a bundle of ties, focused on a load swinging overhead. His heel clips the loose end of the plank. His arms windmill once, instinctively looking for a rail that isn't there. He drops straight through the rectangle. It's not a long scream. It's a short sound that cuts off mid-breath like the air got punched out of the world. Then comes the impact, metal and flesh, followed by a silence that feels too clean for what just happened. For a heartbeat, nobody moves. Not because they don't care, because everyone's mind is doing the same violent arithmetic. Open shaft, swinging load, one wrong step and you add another body. Then the site reacts the way a machine reacts. A foreman appears at a fast walk, eyes scanning not the hole but the people around it. Cover it, he snaps, and two carpenters slide a plank over the opening. Another plank. Nails bite fast. The mouth disappears. "Hoist is waiting," someone shouts, as if the beam has rights and Sal doesn't. Tommy stares, mouth open, watching the plank get nailed down like the job is sealing a mistake inside itself. Someone grabs his shoulder and pulls him away from the edge. "Move," the man hisses. "You freeze, you die." A supervisor looks down once, quick, clinical, then turns away and asks the question that tells you everything about what this place values. "Anybody outside the crew see it?" When nobody answers, the supervisor nods as if that's good news. "Then keep working." Sal is carried out later, wrapped in canvas like scrap material. Tommy sees the boots first. He forces his eyes away because he understands the lesson the site is teaching him. Looking too long is how your knees go soft. At lunch, the foreman writes on a clipboard. Not a name, not a prayer. 2 lines. Delay, 11 minutes. Shaft covered. Somewhere in a small office, a clerk will eventually translate a death into a number. Officially, the story the public repeats will be clean enough to fit on one line. But on the steel, on the ground, in the open shafts, the truth is messier. The job keeps moving, and death is treated like a scheduling problem. By the end of the shift, the building has climbed again. The skyline looks the same from the street. The The men climbing down don't speak about Sal in full sentences. They speak in warnings. Don't step backward near a shaft. Don't stand under a hook. Don't trust a plank that will be nailed later. Because the real rule of this site isn't courage, it's momentum. The building doesn't reward the careful. It rewards the ones who can pretend they didn't just watch a man vanish. If you want the rest of this story, subscribe and hit like, because next you'll see how these deaths stop being shocking and start being repeatable. 2 days after Sal Marino fell, the shaft he vanished through was fixed. Not with rails, not with a permanent barrier, just with better-looking boards and a foreman who barked louder when anyone drifted too close. The opening still breathed cold air upward like a mouth. The difference was that now it had a lid, and the lid had nails, and the nails gave men the illusion that the job had learned something. It hadn't. I need you to understand why deaths on a site like this don't stay tragic and rare. When a project runs at record tempo, risk stops being random. It becomes repeatable. You add height, you add wind, you add swinging loads, you add open shafts and temporary planks and a ground level packed with trucks. Then you remove the one thing that prevents accidents from stacking, the ability to stop. The third morning, the hook did it. A hoist line lifted a crate of bolts and swung it inward, the load hanging beneath like a weighted jaw. The operator corrected the swing, but the correction came late, an inch too much, a second too slow. The hook drifted wide and then snapped back when the cable tightened, cutting an arc through open air. Eddie Klein, a ground rigger with forearms like rope, was bent over a pallet, eyes up, timing his next move between loads. He heard the shout, "Heads!" but the sound arrived at the same time as the hook. It hit him in the ribs with a dull, brutal certainty. No dramatic flying body, no clean fall. Just a man folded as if something inside him had cracked, and the rest of him couldn't hold shape anymore. He tried to inhale and couldn't. His mouth opened and his face went grey in a way that wasn't fear. It was lack of air. For a second, everyone froze, not out of compassion, out of calculation. The hook was still moving. Then the machine's instincts kicked in. "Clear the lane," the foreman roared, and men moved, not toward Eddie first, but around the hoist path, shoving pallets aside, yanking a rope clear, making space so the next load could come in without snagging. 2 workers finally got to Eddie and dragged him by the shoulders toward the edge of the delivery area. His boots left twin smears in the dust. One of them slapped his cheek and said his name too loudly. Like volume could pull a man back. Eddie's eyes were open. He was aware. That was what made it ugly. He tried to speak and only produced a wet, thin gasp. A supervisor crouched for half a heartbeat, checked his breathing, then looked up and scanned the sidewalk outside the fence. "Anyone see it?" he asked. That question mattered more than the hook. They got Eddie behind canvas. Someone tossed sawdust on the blood that had started to spot the concrete. Small, bright drops that didn't belong under a miracle. The hoist operator, white-faced, didn't get yelled at. He got waved back into position. Because on this job, blame is less useful than momentum. Up on the steel that afternoon, Frenchy Gosselin watched the wind change and felt the frame react under his boots like a living thing. The higher they climbed, the less the city sounded like a city. Car horns and street shouts turned into a distant, harmless murmur. Up here there was only wind, metal, and the constant clatter of work. A carpenter crew was laying a temporary walkway across a gap, 2 planks wide, nailed fast on one end, good enough on the other. The planks were supposed to be temporary for a day. Temporary had a way of becoming permanent when the schedule liked it. A young iron worker, Hank O'Rourke, knew enough that his gloves were still clean, stepped onto the plank with a bucket of rivets swinging at his knee. The wind gusted, the plank flexed. One nail screamed out of wood like a tooth pulled from gum. Hank's foot went through the gap up to his shin. He didn't fall all the way. His thigh caught the plank edge, saving his life and stealing his voice. He hung there for a breathless second, half in the world, half out of it, the bucket tipping and spilling rivets that rained down into open air like hot coins. Men lunged for him. Not heroically, mechanically. If he went, the ones who reached would go with him. They hauled him back by the shoulders and rolled him onto the steel. Hank lay there shaking, eyes huge, hands clawing at his own leg as if he couldn't believe it still existed. When he tried to stand, his knee buckled and he let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Frenchy didn't comfort him. He leaned in close enough that the wind couldn't steal the words. "Don't do that again," he said. Hank stared at him, offended, terrified. "I didn't," Frenchy cut him off. Doesn't matter. You almost made other men adjust. Adjustment is how people die up here. They nailed the planks down harder, added another board, and kept walking. Hank was sent down in the temporary elevator with his leg wrapped and his pride torn open. He would limp for weeks. He would be lucky. At street level, luck ran out faster. As the afternoon delivery rush hit, a truck backed in too fast because the driver was trying to beat the next truck in line. A runner darted between bumpers with a clipboard. A shouted warning arrived late. Like all warnings do when noise is constant. The truck's rear wheel clipped the runner's heel and took him off his feet. He went down hard, head striking concrete with a sound that turned every stomach in earshot. For a fraction of a second, the sight went silent. The rare, dangerous silence where men are forced to feel what they just saw. Then the foreman shouted again, "Move! Move! Move!" They pulled the runner clear. Someone pressed a rag to his head. Someone else waved the truck forward anyway because the lane couldn't stall. The driver's hands were shaking so hard he couldn't grip the wheel. A supervisor leaned in and said something into his ear that made him swallow and keep driving. That's how it worked. Each accident was treated like a separate storm, never connected, never allowed to accumulate into a pattern that would force the job to admit what it was doing. By the time the sun fell behind the rising frame, our men were exhausted in a way that made them reckless. They walked like sleepwalkers. They laughed too loud at nothing. They invented private rules and called it safety. No backward steps near shafts. No standing under hooks. No trusting a plank you didn't nail yourself. No hesitation on steel, because the building was training them, not to survive, to keep moving. And if you couldn't keep moving, you didn't just lose your footing, you lost your place. By late summer, the building wasn't just a job site, it was a public performance. On the sidewalk, people stopped to stare up at the steel skeleton climbing into the haze. Vendors sold coffee to men who couldn't afford it. Tourists pointed like they were watching a magic trick. Newspapers loved the tempo, floor counts, dates, the language of a race. In a city strangled by the Depression, speed looked like proof that something still worked. Inside the fence, speed looked like a reason not to look too closely at the ground. A photographer named Lewis Hine showed up with a heavy camera and the calm eyes of someone who'd learned how to stand near danger without flinching. He didn't ask for the broken men in the canvas shade. He asked for the steel. He wanted the picture the public could live with. Men perched on beams, boots dangling, skyline behind them, faces relaxed like height was just another lunch break. Up on the frame, Frank "Frenchy" Goslin sat where he was told to sit. Neil Doherty leaned back with a cigarette and a grin that didn't reach his eyes. They didn't pose because they were fearless. They posed because the day demanded it. If you didn't play your part, there were thousands outside the gate who would. The shutter clicked. The image was clean. The air was bright. The story wrote itself. 2 floors below that photograph, a hook swung wide and clipped a scaffold rail hard enough to make the whole rig jump. A bucket of bolts rattled, tipped, then vomited metal into the open air. It sounded like hail. Down on the street, a woman named Elizabeth Eager was walking past the site with her coat collar up, eyes forward, mind on errands. Normal life trying to keep itself normal. She never looked up. Most people didn't. You can't live in Manhattan staring at the sky in fear. A bolt hit the sidewalk and bounced. Another struck a shoulder. Then one found her, and the crowd noise changed in a single instant. Laughter to screaming, curiosity to panic. Inside the fence, men heard it as a distant roar. Up on the steel, a few heads turned, then snapped back to the work. Looking down was how you lost balance. Looking down was how you died. A supervisor arrived at the edge of the site and did what this job always did first. He controlled the picture. Canvas went up along the street line, police were waved into place, a guard pushed curious faces back. The injured were moved behind fabric so the sidewalk could return to being a sidewalk, not a scene. The hoist didn't stop. The steel didn't pause. The camera kept clicking. That's where the 2 stories formed. Clean and dirty, side by side. The public story said, progress, speed, miracle. The inside story said, it's raining bolts. A reporter showed up that afternoon and tried to get past the gate with a notebook and a stubborn face. He didn't. The guard didn't even argue. He simply blocked the entry as if the building itself had decided it didn't want questions. So the reporter did what reporters do when fences don't open. He hunted the edges. He spoke to a driver who'd seen the canvas go up too fast. He spoke to a policeman who'd heard the name. He spoke to a clerk's cousin in a nearby diner. He built the story from scraps because scraps are what fall out of systems that move too quickly to tidy everything. By morning, the city had an article. Maybe the number in it was right. Maybe it was off, but the headline did what headlines do. It forced the site to react, and the reaction wasn't more safety. It was silence. The next day, the foreman gathered the crews for 30 seconds at shift start, long enough to give an order that sounded like common sense and felt like a muzzle. No talking to papers, no names, no gate conversations. If someone approaches you, you point them to the office. You understand. Men nodded. Some nodded because they agreed. Most nodded because they were hungry. At ground level, the runner who'd been knocked down by a truck in the crush lane didn't return. The job didn't announce it. The job didn't mark a moment. One day he was there, darting between bumpers with a clipboard. The next day someone else was doing it. That's another way tallies get made. A man who dies on site becomes a construction death. A man who dies later, hospital bed, infection, swelling, brain bleed, becomes a family tragedy. Same origin. Different category, different count. That's not mystery, that's bookkeeping. Men started collecting clippings in their pockets the way they collected pay stubs. A tabloid number whispered through the lunch line, 14. A political magazine number passed hand to hand, 40-something. Nobody knew what to believe, but everyone knew why the numbers were fighting, because the official story needed to be small enough to stay heroic. You could see the mechanics of it if you watched The Office. A clerk entered names carefully when the death was undeniable, when it happened inside the fence, on the clock, in a way too public to erase. Everything else became softer words: injury, incident, mishap, illness. Words that sounded like weather, not consequence. Lewis Hine returned another day for more photographs. Men sat on beams again, legs swinging, smiles arranged. The public would see courage. The men up there felt something else, the weight of being used as proof. Below them, carpenters hammered temporary boards into place over open voids and called it protection. Riggers yelled, "Heads!" and kept yelling it until the word meant nothing. A hook whined past a shoulder so close the air itself seemed sliced. By now, the site had learned how to treat death as a problem of flow. If a body blocked a lane, you cleared it. If a story leaked past the fence, you sealed it. If a number grew in the newspapers, you repeated the smaller one until the larger one sounded like gossip. And through it all, the building kept rising, higher, colder, more exposed, until the steel started to feel less like a structure and more like a test the city was making men take without asking if they wanted to. The photographs would survive. The floor count would survive. The clean version would survive. The argument about how many died would survive too, because once a project teaches people to count selectively, the truth doesn't disappear. It just fractures into competing numbers, each one carrying the shape of what someone needed the story to be. By the time the steel reached the upper tiers, the air itself felt thinner, not just from height, but from exhaustion. Men stopped saying good morning. They said, "What floor?" and "How's the wind?" The job had trained them to think in elevation and pressure, not in days. The frame was so tall now that clouds sometimes drifted level with the workers' boots, and the city below looked like a rumour. Up there, a single mistake didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like a sentence. A connector crew worked with stiff fingers, guiding beams into place while the derrick operator fought the wind like it was an extra man tugging on the load. Nails and bolts were carried in buckets that swung and banged against knees. Tools were tied off when somebody remembered, untied when somebody was in a hurry. The difference between those two moments was the difference between a close call and a funeral. At ground level, the site looked cleaner than it used to. Not safer, cleaner. Canvas screens went up faster now. Guards pushed crowds back harder. The outside world had become too interested, and interest is dangerous when a story is being managed, and the story was being managed. I'm going to be blunt, because this is the point where myths harden. A project like this doesn't only build upward, it builds a narrative, one designed to survive scrutiny. When that narrative starts leaking, the response isn't confession, it's control. Fewer names, fewer details, fewer chances for the public to see what the workers see. The final stretch brought a different kind of risk, not the chaotic early days when everything was raw and rushed, but the confident days when everyone believed the machine was unstoppable. That's when it takes someone you didn't expect. It happened on a morning that should have been routine. A cold snap had left a thin glaze on steel, nothing dramatic, just enough slickness to turn a boot sole into a liability. The wind was steady, not gusting. The crew told themselves it was a good day. A carpenter gang was pulling temporary boards from a shaft opening to move a load through. They were supposed to put the guard back immediately. The foreman wanted the load in place first. 2 minutes, he said, then we cover it. 2 minutes is long enough for gravity to win. A runner named Tommy Delaney, same kid who'd watched Sal Marino disappear, came through carrying a small crate of fasteners, head tilted up, eyes tracking a swinging load the way the job had trained him to. His mind was on the hook, on the cable, on the arc, not on the hole at his feet. His boot hit the edge of a loose board. The crate jolted, his arms flailed once, and then he dropped into the open shaft like the building had been waiting for him. The fall was fast. The sound was worse, a sequence of impacts that didn't belong to wood or steel. It belonged to a body being turned into debris. The carpenters froze, faces blank with shock. One of them whispered, "Jesus!" like it was the only word his mouth could find. The foreman moved first, not to pray, not to comfort, to protect the flow. "Cover it," he shouted, voice cracking. "Cover it and keep the hoist moving." A plank slammed over the opening. Another followed. Nails bit. The hole vanished like it had never existed. Someone tried to push past, to look down, to do something human. The foreman shoved him back. "You want another body? You want to be the reason this stops?" That's the moment the sight shows its teeth. It doesn't just normalize death. It weaponizes the fear of making death worse. They found Tommy later. They carried him out under canvas. A few men removed their caps. That was the only ceremony the machine allowed. And then, above them, the steel kept rising. When the building topped out, the city wanted a photograph, not an accounting. Men shook hands for cameras. Foremen smiled. Headlines praised speed like it was virtue. The phrase record-breaking rolled off tongues the way miracle did. Easy, bright, convenient. A photographer framed another shot of workers perched on a beam, legs dangling, Manhattan spread behind them like a promise. In the photograph, nobody looked broken. Nobody looked hungry. Nobody looked like they dragged bodies off lanes so trucks could back in on time. That's what the public bought. An image where risk looked like courage and death looked like an exception. Inside the site office, a clerk turned a page in the ledger and wrote the number that would outlive the men who argued about it. 5. Small enough to sound clean. Final enough to become a fact people repeated without tasting the grit behind it. Outside the fence, the other numbers didn't die. They never do. They circulated in papers and union talk and barroom arguments. 14, 40-something, more than they admit. Those numbers fought because the truth had been split into categories. On-site, off-site, on the clock, after the shift, inside the fence, on the sidewalk. A passerby crushed by falling wood belongs to a different column than a labourer who dies later in a hospital bed, even if both deaths came from the same steel frame. That's how tallies get purified, and that's the real dark history here. The building didn't need a secret meeting to create a clean story. It only needed momentum, controlled access, and paperwork that preferred simplicity over accuracy. When the doors finally opened and crowds poured in to admire the lobby, the marble, the height, the view, none of them were thinking about shafts covered with boards. None of them were thinking about hooks swinging wide. None of them were thinking about how quickly a plank can erase a hole and how quickly a number can erase a name. But the men who built it remembered. Not as poetry, as reflex. They remembered the sound of a body striking steel. They remembered the way foremen scanned for witnesses before they scanned for breath. They remembered how the machine never stopped, only redirected around whatever it didn't want the public to see. And if you're wondering why the argument about the death toll never truly settles, that's why. Because the official story is designed to be repeatable. The lived story is designed to be survivable. I'm going to end with this. If you want to be part of one community that tells the real cost behind monuments, subscribe so we stay together here. Hit like if you think these stories deserve daylight, and comment, when a project finishes early, do you trust its official death number? Or do you think the real count is always hiding in the categories?